The moment he walked back into her world was the moment he realized he no longer belonged in it. The crystal chandeliers of the Astoria Grand Ballroom cast 1,000 fractured lights across the polished marble floor, each reflection catching on the sleek black fabric of Naomi Carter's gown as she stepped into the room like a quiet storm, controlled, elegant, undeniable, and for a brief second the entire crowd seemed to pause, as if the air itself had shifted to make space for her presence. Because this was not the woman they remembered, not the one who had once stood in the shadow of a man's name. This was someone else entirely, someone who had built herself from silence and steel, and at the far end of the ballroom, standing beneath a cascade of golden light that once would have belonged to him, Ethan Whitmore felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest, something dangerously close to hesitation, because the woman walking toward the center stage was the same woman he had left behind 5 years ago. But everything else about her had changed. Her posture carried no trace of uncertainty. Her gaze did not search for approval, and the diamond bracelet resting against her wrist caught the light not as decoration but as declaration, a quiet signal that she had rewritten every rule he once believed defined her. And then he saw them, two small figures at the edge of the stage, dressed in perfectly tailored miniature suits, their hands steady, their eyes bright with a confidence that didn't belong to children who had grown up without a father. And when one of them looked up at Naomi and smiled, calling her Mom, with a warmth that carried effortlessly across the room, the sound landed in Ethan's chest like a truth he could no longer outrun. His breath stalled, his world narrowing to that single moment where past and present collided without mercy, because the question rose before he could stop it, sharp and undeniable. Are they mine? But the answer was already written in the quiet symmetry of their features, in the unmistakable echo of his own reflection, staring back at him through eyes that held none of his arrogance. And for the first time in years, the man who had built empires without blinking found himself unable to move, unable to speak, because the power he once wielded so effortlessly no longer reached her, no longer defined the space between them. And as Naomi took her place beneath the spotlight, her voice calm, measured, carrying the kind of authority that wasn't borrowed but earned, the room leaned in, drawn not by spectacle, but by something deeper, something quieter, something that could not be bought or taken or replaced. And Ethan understood, too late, that whatever he had left behind 5 years ago had not been waiting for him to return. It had transformed, it had risen, and it had done so without him. The applause rose slowly at first, polite and measured, then building into something warmer as Naomi Carter finished her speech with the kind of quiet certainty that did not ask for validation but commanded respect. And as she stepped away from the podium, the golden light followed her like it had chosen her rather than the other way around, while Ethan Whitmore remained exactly where he was, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass in his hand, the chilled surface doing nothing to steady the sudden heat in his chest, because the woman he was watching was no longer a memory he could control or rewrite. She was real, present, and entirely beyond his reach. And when she turned, just for a fraction of a second, their eyes met across the crowded room. The distance between them filled not with noise, but with everything that had been left unsaid 5 years ago, everything that had never been given the chance to be explained. And yet there was no accusation in her gaze, no visible anger, only a calm recognition that unsettled him far more than any confrontation ever could have, because it meant she no longer needed answers from him. And that realization pressed heavier than regret itself. While across the room the two boys moved closer to her side, one reaching for her hand with an instinctive trust that spoke of years built on consistency and care, not absence and excuses. And Ethan felt the truth settle deeper, undeniable now, their posture, their quiet confidence, even the way they carried themselves in a room full of power. It was all too familiar, reflections of a life he had walked away from before it had even begun. And for a moment the noise of the ballroom faded into something distant, like a memory losing its edges, as his mind pulled him backward to a different night, one that had been quieter, smaller, but far more significant than he had allowed himself to understand at the time. The soft glow of a city apartment, the faint hum of traffic outside the windows, and Naomi standing near the kitchen counter with something fragile in her hands, her voice steady but carrying a weight he had not paused long enough to hear. Because his phone had been ringing, because opportunity had been calling. Louder than anything else, because he had convinced himself that there would always be time to come back. Always another moment to fix what could be postponed. And now, standing in a room where she no longer waited for him, he understood the cost of that assumption. Because time had not stood still, it had moved forward without him, shaping a life that no longer included his place in it. And when Naomi gently guided the boys toward the exit, her hand resting lightly on each of their shoulders, the image struck him with a clarity that left no room for denial. She had built something whole from what he had abandoned, something steady, something real. And as the doors opened and the city lights spilled in beyond the ballroom, she did not look back, not once, leaving him standing beneath the same chandeliers that once symbolized his control, now reflecting only the quiet truth that he had not been left behind. He had chosen to leave, and everything that followed had simply honored that decision. You did not lose everything in a single moment. You lost it in the moments you chose not to stay. The memory did not arrive gently. It surfaced with a clarity that refused to soften its edges, pulling Ethan back into that apartment where the city lights once painted long shadows across the hardwood floor, where the air had felt still in a way that should have warned him something important was waiting. But he had been too focused on the vibration of his phone, too distracted by the promise of expansion, contracts, and a future he believed could not afford delay. And Naomi had been standing there, not in a gown of power or under the glow of chandeliers, but in a simple sweater, her hands wrapped around something small, something that required attention, something that required him. And when she spoke his name, it had not been loud, not urgent, but steady, the kind of steadiness that asked to be heard rather than demanded it. Yet he had answered without turning fully toward her, his voice already divided, already halfway out the door, because the call mattered, because timing mattered, because everything in his world had always been about moving forward, never about pausing long enough to see what stood right in front of him. And she had waited just a second longer than she should have needed to, before stepping closer, before placing the small object on the counter between them, a quiet offering, a moment that held more weight than any deal he had ever signed. But he had only glanced at it, only enough to register its meaning without allowing it to settle, because the words that followed from the voice on his phone had pulled him further away, pulling him into a future that promised growth, prestige, a partnership that required immediate presence overseas. And when he finally looked back at her, really looked, there had been something different in her eyes, not anger, not even disappointment, but a shift, subtle and irreversible, as if a door had quietly closed behind her without making a sound. And she had nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. The kind of understanding that comes when a person realizes they are no longer part of someone else's priorities. And he had taken that nod as permission, as acceptance, as confirmation. That leaving was temporary, that everything would remain exactly where he had left it, waiting, unchanged. And so he had packed quickly, efficiently, the way he handled every decision in his life, reducing something profound into a series of practical steps, a flight booked, a meeting confirmed, a future secured, while behind him Naomi remained still, her presence becoming quieter with each passing minute until it felt less like a shared space and more like two separate worlds existing side by side. And when he walked out that door, he had not looked back, not because he did not care, but because he believed there would always be another moment to return, another chance to address what he had postponed, another opportunity to stand in that same room and pick up where he had left off, but standing now in the aftermath of a life that had continued without him. He understood the truth that had been waiting all along. Some moments do not pause. They do not wait to be revisited. They move forward, reshaping everything in their path. And by the time you return, the life you thought you could step back into has already become something else entirely, something that no longer has a place for you. The news did not arrive as a whisper. It arrived as a headline, sharp and impossible to ignore, spreading across screens and conversations with the kind of precision that left no room for interpretation. Ethan Whitmore engaged to a European heiress. The announcement framed in polished photographs and carefully chosen words that painted a future of power, alliance, and expansion. And somewhere in a quiet apartment thousands of miles away from the life he was stepping into, Naomi Carter stood in front of a television that suddenly felt too loud for the silence in the room, her reflection faintly visible against the glass as the image of the man she once knew smiled beside another woman whose presence fit seamlessly into the world he had chosen. And for a moment the air seemed to thin, not from shock, but from clarity, because everything she needed to understand had just been confirmed without a single word spoken between them. And she did not reach for her phone, did not search for explanations, did not ask questions that would only echo back empty. Instead, she reached for the remote and turned the screen off, allowing the room to return to its quiet state, the kind of quiet that no longer felt uncertain but resolved. And as she placed her hand gently against her abdomen, the gesture carried more meaning than any conversation ever could, because this was no longer about what had been lost. It was about what remained, what was growing, what depended on her strength rather than his presence. And in that moment something within her shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a steady certainty that would shape everything that followed. She moved through the apartment with deliberate calm, removing the framed photographs that once held shared memories, setting them aside not with anger, but with finality, folding away the life that had been built on promises that no longer held weight. And when she reached the small velvet box resting on the dresser, she paused, her fingers brushing lightly over its surface before opening it one last time. The ring inside catching the soft light from the window, no longer a symbol of commitment, but a reminder of a chapter that had already closed. And without hesitation, she placed it back inside and shut the lid, the sound quiet but definitive, marking the end of something that would not be revisited. And as the evening light faded into night, Naomi did not allow herself to linger in what could have been. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, the pages blank and waiting, and began to write. Not plans for reconciliation, not questions about the past, but steps forward, practical, intentional, grounded in a future she would build on her own terms. Doctor appointments, financial adjustments, job applications, each line forming a structure where uncertainty had once lived. And though the road ahead was not easy, though it carried challenges she had not anticipated, it was hers. Entirely hers, shaped not by someone else's decisions, but by her own resolve. And as the city outside continued its endless rhythm, Naomi Carter made a choice that would define everything that came after. She would not wait for him to return. She would not leave space for explanations that came too late. She would move forward, one step at a time, with a strength that did not need to be seen to be real. And in doing so, she began to build a life that no longer depended on the man who had walked away, but on the woman who chose to rise. Strength is not built in the moments the world applauds you. It is built in the moments no one sees you survive. The days that followed did not arrive with dramatic change or sudden clarity. They came quietly, one after another, measured not by milestones but by persistence, by the steady rhythm of a life that had to be rebuilt from the ground up. And Naomi Carter learned quickly that resilience was not a single decision, but a series of small, deliberate choices made over and over again. She woke before sunrise in a modest apartment that held none of the luxury she once knew. The air cooler, the silence deeper, but it was hers, entirely hers. And as the first light filtered through the blinds, she would sit at the edge of her bed, one hand resting gently over the life growing within her, grounding herself in the only certainty that mattered now, that she was no longer living for what had been lost, but for what was still becoming. The mornings were practical, structured with intention, a part-time position at a local clinic, long hours that demanded focus and left little room for reflection, followed by evenings spent studying, researching, building knowledge that would one day become the foundation of something greater, something she could not yet fully see but refused to stop working toward. And there were moments, quiet and uninvited, when exhaustion pressed against her resolve, when the weight of doing everything alone felt heavier than she allowed herself to acknowledge. But even then she did not break. She adjusted, she breathed, she continued, because stopping was not an option she could afford. And when the day finally arrived, not marked by celebration, but by a calm acceptance of what needed to be faced, she entered the hospital with the same quiet strength that had carried her through every step before it, the sterile lights above casting a soft glow that reflected not fear, but determination. And hours later, when the room filled with the soft sounds of new life, when two small voices entered the world and changed it entirely. Naomi did not cry from sorrow or relief. She smiled, a small, steady expression that held everything she had endured and everything she was ready to become. Because in that moment the future was no longer uncertain. It was tangible, real, resting in her arms with a weight that was both fragile and powerful, and the nights that followed were long, filled with the quiet demands of care, the soft rhythm of breathing, the gentle reassurance of presence. And though there was no one to share those hours with, no one to divide the responsibility or ease the burden, there was also no one to take credit for the strength it required, no one to claim a place in what she was building. And as the months turned into years, Naomi Carter did not simply survive. She evolved, her knowledge expanding, her confidence sharpening, her vision becoming clearer with each step forward, until the idea that had once been just lines in a notebook began to take form, a healthcare startup rooted in access, in care, in the understanding of what it meant to be overlooked and still rise. And while the world that Ethan Whitmore had chosen continued without her, filled with headlines and distant successes that no longer held any meaning, Naomi built something quieter, something deeper, something that did not need recognition to be real, because every decision she made, every sacrifice she carried, every step she took forward was no longer about proving anything to anyone else. It was about honoring the life she had chosen to create. And in doing so, she became someone the past could no longer define, someone who no longer needed to be remembered by the man who had left, because she had already become everything he never stayed long enough to see. Success does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly. Then one day the world realizes it has been there all along. The transition did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, almost invisibly, as the years carried Naomi Carter forward with a steady rhythm that never relied on luck, but on consistency, discipline, and an unshakable sense of purpose. Her small apartment became both a home and a workspace, filled with the soft hum of laptops, stacks of research papers, and the quiet laughter of two young boys who grew up watching their mother build something from nothing. And while other stories might have marked success with a single defining moment, hers was written in the accumulation of effort, the early mornings that began before sunrise, the late nights that stretched long after the city had gone quiet, the countless decisions made without applause, without recognition, but always with intention. And as her healthcare platform began to take shape, it carried not just innovation but experience, an understanding of gaps in care that she had lived through rather than studied from a distance. And people began to notice, first in small ways, a local article, a speaking invitation, a grant that opened doors previously closed, and then in larger ones, partnerships, funding, recognition that positioned her not as someone who had survived hardship, but as someone who had transformed it into something meaningful, something scalable, something powerful. And through it all, Naomi remained the same in the ways that mattered most, composed, focused, never allowing external validation to define her sense of worth, because she had built that long before anyone else began to see it. And her sons grew alongside her success, their presence grounding her, reminding her daily of why she had chosen this path, their laughter filling spaces that once held silence, their curiosity shaping a future that felt expansive rather than uncertain. And there were moments when the past attempted to surface, brief flashes of headlines or names that once held significance, reminders of a life that had moved in a different direction. But those moments no longer carried weight. They passed through her awareness without anchoring themselves, because she had outgrown the need to revisit what no longer aligned with who she had become. And when the invitation arrived, embossed in clean lettering, an exclusive gala in New York City recognizing leaders in healthcare innovation, it was not a surprise but a confirmation, a quiet acknowledgement of a journey that had already proven itself. And as she prepared for the evening, selecting a black gown that reflected both simplicity and strength, fastening a bracelet that symbolized not luxury but achievement, she did not see the event as a destination, but as another step, another room she would walk into with the same calm confidence she had carried from the beginning. And as her sons stood beside her, adjusting their jackets with a seriousness that mirrored her own, she knelt briefly, meeting their eyes with a warmth that balanced her composure. reminding them without words that everything they were stepping into had been built with intention, with resilience, with love. And as they left the apartment together, stepping into a city that no longer felt overwhelming but familiar, Naomi Carter carried with her not just success, but something far more enduring, a life that had been shaped entirely on her own terms, a future that no longer depended on recognition from the past, and a presence so steady that when she entered any room, she did not need to announce who she was. The world would simply understand. Regret does not arrive when everything is lost. It arrives the moment you finally understand what you had. Ethan Whitmore had always believed that power was measured by control, by the ability to shape outcomes, to predict movements, to stay 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. But standing in the quiet aftermath of a life that had shifted beyond his reach, he began to understand that there were some things no amount of influence could reclaim, and the empire he had once expanded so aggressively had not remained untouched. The overseas merger that had once seemed like a strategic victory had slowly unraveled, partnerships strained under competing interests, decisions made in haste revealing consequences that could not be undone. And the marriage that had been announced with polished headlines and calculated elegance had dissolved not in scandal, but in absence, a quiet separation that reflected not betrayal but incompatibility. Two people aligned in ambition, but disconnected in everything that required depth. And now, back in the city he had once dominated, Ethan found himself navigating a landscape that felt both familiar and distant. The buildings unchanged, but the meaning behind them altered, because he was no longer the same man who had left. And yet the world had not waited for him to redefine himself. It had simply moved on. And when the invitation to the gala arrived, he accepted without hesitation, not out of confidence, but out of something less defined, a pull he could not ignore, a sense that there were answers waiting in a room he had not yet entered. And when he stepped inside, the realization came quickly, not as a revelation, but as a recognition. Because Naomi Carter was no longer a part of his past, she was a presence in his present, undeniable, established, and entirely beyond the narrative he had once assigned to her. And as the evening unfolded, he watched from a distance that felt both physical and symbolic, observing the way people approached her not with curiosity but with respect, the way her voice carried without effort, the way her son stood beside her with a confidence that spoke of stability rather than absence. And for the first time, Ethan saw the full shape of what he had left behind, not just a relationship, not just a moment, but a life that had grown stronger in his absence, and the question that had formed earlier returned, sharper now, more insistent. Are they mine? But this time it was not driven by curiosity, it was driven by recognition, by the undeniable connection that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. And as he took a step forward, closing the distance he had once created so easily, he understood that whatever happened next would not be controlled, not by strategy, not by status, not by the power he had once relied on, because the woman he was about to face did not need anything from him. And that changed everything. And when he finally reached her, when the space between them narrowed to something real and unavoidable, there was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, only a quiet stillness that carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. And in that stillness, Ethan Whitmore realized that this was not a moment of reclaiming. It was a moment of reckoning, one that had been 5 years in the making, and one that he could no longer walk away from. Closure is not something you are given. It is something you choose. The space between them felt smaller than it should have, not because of distance, but because of everything that now stood clearly defined where confusion once lived. And Naomi Carter did not step back, did not hesitate. She simply looked at Ethan Whitmore with the same calm presence she had carried all evening, her expression composed, her posture steady, as if this moment had already been processed long before it arrived. And for a brief second Ethan found himself searching for something familiar in her gaze, something that would connect this woman to the memory he still held. But what he found instead was clarity, the kind that leaves no room for misinterpretation. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than he expected, stripped of the authority he once relied on. The question forming without the protection of control, are they mine? The words lingering in the air between them, not as an accusation, not even as a demand, but as a recognition he could no longer avoid. And Naomi did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation but out of choice, allowing the silence to settle fully, allowing him to feel the weight of a question that had arrived years too late. And when she did speak, her voice was measured, even, carrying no trace of anger, only truth. "They are mine," she said, the words simple but complete. And in that moment Ethan understood that the answer he had been seeking was not one he was entitled to receive, not anymore, because the ownership of that story, of those years, of those lives, belonged entirely to her. And the realization settled into him with a quiet force that no argument could counter, because she was not denying him out of spite. She was defining the boundaries he had abandoned, and for the first time he saw what that looked like in practice, not rejection, but independence, not distance, but self-possession. And he took a breath, slower this time, grounding himself in a moment he could not control. "I did not know," he said, the statement incomplete, insufficient even as it left him, because it carried none of the weight of what had actually happened. And Naomi's expression did not change, not because she did not hear him, but because the explanation no longer held value. "You did not ask," she replied, the sentence soft but precise, cutting through everything he might have tried to build around his absence. And there it was, the truth he could not reframe, not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, but a choice, his choice, repeated in every moment he chose not to return, not to call, not to stay. And as the silence returned, it no longer felt uncertain, it felt resolved, as if something that had been unfinished had finally reached its conclusion. And Ethan realized that whatever he had imagined this encounter might be, it was not about reopening anything. It was about understanding that there was nothing left to reopen, and Naomi did not need closure from him because she had already created it for herself. And as she glanced briefly toward her sons, who waited nearby with quiet patience, her focus shifted, effortlessly, not away from him but beyond him, toward what mattered now. And when she looked back at him one last time, there was no bitterness in her eyes, no lingering attachment, only a calm acknowledgement of what had been and what would never be again. And in that moment Ethan Whitmore understood that forgiveness, if it existed at all, would not look like reconciliation. It would look like this: a woman standing in her own life, untouched by the past he could no longer change. The most powerful ending is not when someone comes back, but when you realize you no longer need them to. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass doors of the ballroom as Naomi Carter turned without hesitation, her heels moving in a steady rhythm that echoed softly against the polished floor, each step measured, intentional, and completely free of the weight she once carried. And the two boys fell into place beside her as if it had always been this way, their small hands brushing against hers with a quiet familiarity that spoke of years built on presence rather than promises. And behind her Ethan Whitmore remained still, not because he was unable to move, but because for the first time in his life, movement no longer guaranteed control. And as he watched her walk away, the realization did not come as a sharp pain or a dramatic collapse. It arrived quietly, settling into him with a clarity that left no room for denial. She had not been waiting. She had not been hoping. She had not built her life around the possibility of his return. She had moved forward completely, and in doing so, she had created a reality where his absence no longer mattered. And that truth stood heavier than any loss he had experienced before, because it was not something he could negotiate or repair. It was something he had chosen, and now he had to live within the outcome of that choice. And as the doors opened and the cool night air met Naomi's steady breath, the city greeted her not as someone returning, but as someone who belonged. The skyline reflecting in the glass like a quiet affirmation of everything she had built, everything she had become. And she paused for only a second, not to look back, but to take in the moment fully, to recognize how far she had come from the woman who once stood in silence waiting to be chosen, because now she was the one choosing her path, her future, her peace. And as one of the boys looked up at her and smiled, asking a simple question about what came next, she returned the smile with a warmth that carried certainty, because for her, the answer was no longer complicated. It was forward, always forward. And inside the ballroom, the noise resumed, conversations continuing, glasses clinking. The world moving on as it always did. But for Ethan, everything felt different, not because the world had changed, but because he finally understood his place within it, not at the center, not in control, but as someone who had once been given something real and had chosen not to stay. And as he stood there, surrounded by the same symbols of success he had spent years chasing, they no longer held the same meaning. Because success without presence, without connection, without the courage to stay when it mattered most, had revealed itself to be incomplete. And in that quiet realization, there was no dramatic resolution, no immediate redemption, only understanding. The kind that arrives too late to change the past, but just in time to define what remains. And somewhere beyond those doors, Naomi Carter continued, walking, not as someone escaping what had been, but as someone fully aligned with what was ahead, leaving behind not just a man, but an entire version of her life that no longer belonged to her. And in that final distance between them, the story did not end with regret. It ended with truth, that sometimes the greatest form of justice is not revenge, it is becoming someone who no longer needs it.